It's early in the morning, May 29, 1914. The coal-carrying freighter Storstar is plodding its way slowly along in the dark. Few minutes ago, the lights from another ship was spotted way ahead in the distance. But then, at the worst possible moment, a dense fog bank rolled in and shrouded the ship from view. Storstar's crew can't see more than 100 feet in front of their ship. The two vessels signal to one another in the fog, blasting their horns. Then Storkter's captain spots something terrifying out of the murky black. He sees lights where they shouldn't be, close by, from a ship directly in front of him. Then the fog dissolves to reveal the still cliff face of an ocean liner's side, and his ship is about to crash straight into it. He rings down an urgent order to his engine room, full speed of stern. He doesn't even look to see if his orders followed. His eyes are fixated wide with terror. The massive ship that looms over him. Store starts, propeller thrashes in the water, but it's too late. Collision can't be avoided. The two ships are separated and lose each other in the fog. But 10 minutes after the impact, all was still and quiet. When drifting across the water from somewhere out in the darkness, Captain Anderson and his crew began to hear something. It was the sound of screaming. The mighty St. Lawrence River, at its widest point. It spans over 100 kilometers or 62 miles in width, dive for 76 meters or 250 feet straight down in some spots, and you'd still not see the riverbed. Now, like any great body of water in the world, it's a favorite horn for pleasure craft and water sportsmen, but it's also a vital link from eastern Canada to the Atlantic. Travel 250 kilometers, 155 miles upriver, you'll find something extraordinary. Here, on the riverbed, encrusted in marine growth, tangled and broken, lies the wreck of a once great ship. You wouldn't know it. Very little is recognizable. It's a cold, dark, lonely place, and only the most skilled divers in the world ever visit. What if I told you that this ship was once the pride of its owners, so renowned and beloved that even had a popular waltz written about it? The ship that carried thousands of hopefuls to new lives in Canada from Europe. Now, scattered throughout its wreck, you can find bones, hundreds of them. These were once people looking to visit their family and friends, starting new jobs, or going to new schools, musicians, clerks, engineers, performers, children. 110 years ago, this tangle of wreckage looked very different. In May 1914, in the uneasy few months before the First World War erupted, a ship was preparing to leave for Britain. She was big, luxurious, and smartly painted, beautifully proportioned, and beloved. Ocean liner. She'd been a familiar sight on the St. Lawrence River, having sailed between Britain and Canada for the better part of a decade. She was reliable and trusty, but also glamorous and comfortable. If you'd stood on the dock as passengers swarmed aboard that morning, you might have gazed up in admiring wonder. You know, gleaming nameplate, the golden letters proudly spelled out the name, which made her a favorite of so many Irish immigrants. She was called the Empress of Ireland. The Empress of Ireland was the brainchild of the Canadian Pacific Railway, an incredible company with vast, sprawling network of transport that circled the globe. It started in the 1880s as an effort to expand the Canadian railway network out of Ontario. By 1886, the company had spanned the North American continent, when you could haul goods and passengers from one coast to another in just 6 days, a journey that once would have taken weeks on horseback or by ox train. To complement this network, the company negotiated with the British government to establish a steamship service operating between Canada, Britain, and the Far East. By the early 1900s, this profitable service had grown to include a simply massive fleet of hundreds of ships. It was possible to travel from Japan to Canada, and then to keep on going back to Japan, without once stepping foot from off of a Canadian Pacific Railway ship or train. The world's biggest and best-known ships operated the glamorous transatlantic route from Liverpool or Southampton in Britain to New York in America. Not only did this caught millionaires and the famous, but it also carried hundreds of thousands of hopeful immigrants from Europe to start new lives in America. The Canada offered plenty of opportunities to migrants as well, so ships plied the Atlantic from Britain to Quebec or Montreal in 1903. The Canadian Pacific Railway rushed to capitalize on this bustling trade, but this was not the glamorous New York service. The show Canadian Pacific. If it's early, ships were second-hand, having been bought from other lines at a bargain, that there were mostly combination cargo passenger ships with just as much focus on the freight that they carried as the people. So to get a leg up on the competition and truly cement their transatlantic dominance, Canadian Pacific Line set out to invest in their future. They would order 2 brand new huge ocean liners to be built to an exacting standard. They would be every bit as glamorous and comfortable as their bigger rivals on the millionaire's route to New York, and hopefully attract the clientele because of it. The pair of identical sister ships would take turns operating between Liverpool and Quebec in the summer season, and they need to run at high speeds, 18 knots, to ensure a regular weekly service from both sides of the Atlantic. Their speed would be complemented by their size. Passengers wanted safety and comfort, and Canadian Pacific would give it to them. The pair of sister ships would be by far the biggest in the Canadian Pacific's fleet, 14,191 gross registered tons, 570 feet, 170 meters in length. The order was placed in 195 with Fairfield Shipbuilding at Govan, Scotland. It was a great choice. Fairfield was a renowned builder of warships for the Admiralty. The 2 ships were built side by side to the most modern specifications, being 14,000-odd gross registered tons. Their bulk meant that they could comfortably carry 1,500 people across 4 classes. 1906, 14,000 tons wasn't a monumental volume, but it wasn't tiny either. Just a decade earlier, the 2 new ships would have been considered the largest in the world. Such was the rapid rate of technological development. In January 1906, the second of the 2 sisters thundered down the slipway on her launching day. The first ship had been named Empress of Britain, and the second lighter was called the Empress of Ireland. On introduction, the 2 ships had caused quite a stir. They elevated the experience for passengers crossing to Canada by a huge margin, not just because of their comfort. The ships were safe. They've been built with all the modern technological developments. Double-bottomed hulls would prevent sinking from grounding on rocks. Tall steel walls called bulkheads divided the ships into 11 individual self-contained sections called compartments. These could be sealed off from each other by heavy cast-iron doors, which would be hand-cranked down, creating a watertight seal. The Emperor sisters could remain afloat with any 2 of their compartments flooded. Safety tests were run to see how quickly the doors could be shut in the event of emergency. The captain rang down an order from the bridge on a telegraph, signaling the crew to close all doors. The men below rushed into action. Stewards ran to cupboards to fetch heavy brass keys that could slot over the winding shafts, and then bodily hand cranked the heavy doors shut. A well-drilled crew could have all 24 watertight doors closed in just 3 minutes. None of it was automatic or electric. The system relied on good training and a quick reaction. For 6 years, the Empress sisters proved hugely popular and were a massive success for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Then, 1912, something happened that shocked the shipping, well, as a whole. White Star Line's Titanic, which was far more modern and over 3 times larger than the Empress sisters, had sunk on its maiden voyage. With a huge loss of life, public confidence in shipping technology was badly shaken. Lions rushed to fill their ships with lifeboats and promote their safety features. Canadian Pacific were at pains to proudly point out that their Empress sisters had lifeboat and raft capacity for 1,860 people. As long as the watertight doors could be shut in an emergency, the ships would stay afloat and all the lifeboats could be launched safely. 8 years after introduction, the Empress of Ireland was tied up at the port of Quebec. It was May 28, 1914, and an excited stream of passengers steadily made their way up the ship's gangways and poured inside what would be their new home for the next 4 days. Just last month, the St. Lawrence River, which freezes over in winter, it had its ice break and thaw. Now, the Empress was about to depart on its first round voyage for the season. She was headed for Liverpool, and up the gangways, tried a variety of characters from all walks of life. 1914 was a monumental year for modern world history. We know now that in May, the outbreak of the First World War was just 3 months away. Tensions in Europe were high. People could feel it for those who'd made the trip out to Canada in years prior from mainland Europe, Britain, or Ireland, of the temptation to get home and see family, maybe even to try persuading them to go back to Canada with them to safety, must have been great. The two sister ships. It was the Empress of Ireland who had attracted considerable interest and affection from Irish migrants. On special occasions, she flew the green flag of Erin, and every year at St. Patrick's Day, a huge gala dinner was held on board, with lots of singing and dancing. That Thursday morning, some 700 third-class passengers boarded the ship. Many were going home to see family. Some had made the migration effort out to Canada, but have not found their success and were returning home disappointed. They came from all over, and not just Canada. The American Midwest and the Great Lakes was well represented by the third-class contingent, and it included some 300 Detroit Ford factory workers had been laid off in the summer. There were Poles, New Zealanders, Italian, Swedes, and of course, Irish. A mass of people from across the globe. They must have stared up at their big ship with a sense of pride. They knew they were traveling on the best. Up other gangways strode the second-class passengers, clerks, businessmen, bankers. Many mothers were traveling with their children to meet husbands who were away on business trips abroad. For many young ones, this would be their first overseas trip. 138 children, in total, boarded the Empress of Ireland that day, wide-eyed at the size of their ship and the bustling scenes that were happening around them. Then there were many uniforms with shiny silver buttons on their collars and caps. They proudly showed the red emblem of the Salvation Army. The Army was a church and humanitarian organization which had been formed in the 1800s to reform societies down and out, bring them closer to God and salvation. This had been done in an era where wealth disparity was monumental, and few cared for the plights of society's discards, the homeless, the drunk, or the downtrodden. The Salvation Army had fed mouths and given shelter to thousands across the globe, and in 1914, a massive conference was being held in London. This was an opportunity for members of the organization to come together for world peace, and to showcase what their own little chapter of the Salvation Army looked like. They were noted for their staff bands. It started as a quirky tradition in 1879, but by 1914, the sight of Salvationist musicians was familiar and well-loved. That day, 167 members of Canada's Salvation Army boarded the Empress of Ireland in second class. They were headed by their beloved commissioner, David Rees, a kindly bearded man of 57, and joining him was his wife, Ruth. It actually met in the Salvation Army, and fallen for one another, and up the ship's gangway, she must have anxiously corralled the couple's 3 young children across Canada. 500 delegates were making the trip across the ocean, with many booked in other ships in the coming days. In early June, there'd be a huge reception at the Royal Albert Hall, and the expected turnout was 5,000 people. Salvationists gaze down excitedly from the decks of the ship, and their comrades are turned out to see them off from the dockside. First class was underbooked for this voyage, which was unusual for that time of year, but what the class lacked in number more than made up for in personality. Calmly onto the ship strode Mr. Lawrence Irving and his wife, Mabel Hackney, renowned actors, the two of them. Lawrence was the son of legendary actor and manager, Sir Henry Irving. From a young age, he must have known he had big shoes to fill. The young man had wowed audiences on the stage and turned his hand to writing hit plays. But it was in 1901 that a young actress joined his theater company, and his life was to change forever. Mabel Hackney was a talented actress from Wales, and she enchanted audiences across the Atlantic. For Lawrence, it was like love at first sight. The two were married in 1903, and they were practically inseparable. Co-starring in plays, the Lawrence would often write himself. They were described as the best-suited couple imaginable. Lawrence was famously defensive of his wife. Once, he had publicly sought out and lambasted a critic for daring to denounce Mabel's acting talents. He had a good sense of humor, too. If he was on stage and an audience member coughed, he paused the play and offered the theatergoer a cough lozenge. "Do you need a cough, mothers, sir?" Lawrence and Mabel were at the height of their careers, and they just led their theater troupe on a highly successful tour of Canada, where they generated rave reviews. They're at last heading for home, proud of their success. But then there'd been a small holdup. Their agent had switched their booking. Originally, the whole theater troupe was supposed to travel on the Empress of Ireland, but they were moved onto White Star Line's Titanic, which was due to sail 3 days later. Lawrence was annoyed. He was eager to get back to London as soon as possible to get started on his newest play. He had his tickets switched back to the Empress, along with his wife, and the rest of the troupe wouldn't be ready in time. But the Irvings also booked their juvenile lead, Harold Neville, and his wife, actress Nels Vrain. The two, anxious to get home and see their 3 young children as soon as possible. The party said goodbye to their friends and left them in Canada. They thought they'd be reunited within the week. The Irvings' presence aboard the ship attracted the most attention, but another noted member of society boarded that day. So Henry Seton Carr, the legendary sportsman and adventurer. At 61 years of age, the man had a voracious appetite for activity. He swam, hunted, hiked, rode golfed. He was at last headed for home after a series of business trips abroad. There's no doubt, once on board the ship, he must have been planning for his next big adventure. The time of departure was drawing near. From the dockside, well wishes gathered to see the big ship off. Some waved to loved ones on board, but others were just strangers, excited to see the first departure of the Emperors for this season. Gazing down from the bridge, at all of the hubbub of activity was the Empress's master, Captain Henry Kendall. Kendall was a young up-and-comer in the Canadian Pacific Railway Service, at a sprightly 40 years of age. But even by 1914, he had made quite a name for himself. In 19, he had survived a shipwreck off Newfoundland, and then 2 years later, he had worked with none other than Mr. Guglielmo Marconi himself in helping to develop ship-to-shore wireless radio. He joined Canadian Pacific in 1910, then became something of a celebrity for the most bizarre of reasons. He was in command of the older Canadian Pacific ship, Montrose, when a suspicious passenger caught his attention leaving from Britain. Kendall suspected the man of being a notorious wanted fugitive and radioed back. Scotland Yard was hunting a dangerous murderer, and they suspected him of fleeing the country. Thanks to Kendall's radio message, a police presence was waiting for the Montrose in Canada. And on boarding, the party was glad to discover that the suspicious passenger was none other than Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen, who'd murdered his wife and fled with his accomplice and lover, who disguised herself on board as a young boy. Disguise hadn't worked. The keen-eyed Kendall had figured them both out immediately for who they truly were. It was the first time that radio had helped apprehend criminals. Top it all off, as captain of the Lake Champlain, Kendall had sped to the rescue of the Allen liner, Corsican, after it struck an iceberg. Kendall was Canadian Pacific Lion's rising star. It seemed natural to put him in charge of one of the 2 most treasured and glamorous ships. This would be his first voyage captaining the Empress of Ireland down the St. Lawrence River. At around 4:30 p.m., all were at last aboard, and the ship was set to leave. Tugs came to her assistance, and the lines that connected the ship to shore were at last cast off. The big ship slowly pulled away from the quay, where a dense crowd of people waved and cheered. Then, in the warm summer air, the strains of music began to float. The Salvation Army band had quickly assembled on deck. Unexpectedly, they held their instruments and played a final song, a farewell to their friends and families and a promise. It was the hymn, "God be with you till we meet again. We'll head home. Hey, what's up? I love you so much." By late afternoon, the Empress had cleared the channel, and Captain Kendall had opened her engines up. The ship thundered along slowly, leaving Quebec behind. For many, this will be their last ever sight of home. 1, 2, 3. As the Empress slipped away into the evening, the gathered crowd dispersed, and the ship's passengers began to get settled into their new home. 200 miles downriver, another ship was underway, And this was a very different vessel to the Empress of Ireland, where the Empress was elegant and luxurious. This other ship was utilitarian and basic. It was a cargo ship, a bulk freighter, loaded deep into the water with its hull straining under the bulk of 10,000 tons of coal. But the small crew on board their cargo ship was also a home. And this was a happy one. The ship was named Store Stud, only 4 years at sea and extremely modern. When she'd first arrived at Philadelphia on a maiden voyage, 1911, she disembarked the largest single load of iron ore ever carried by a single ship until that point. It might sound now like a dubious honor, but her crew and owners must have been extremely proud. On the bridge stood Captain Thomas Anderson, a gruff old sea dog, broad-chested, and with a huge mustache. He'd been at sea for 30 years, and he knew his business well. But aside from his 30-odd crew, there was another important person on board who even kept the captain in check. His wife, Mrs. Anderson, had cheerfully joined her husband on many voyages and turned the captain's Spartan cabin into a home, with soft furnishings and even new curtains. The ship below Anderson's feet was tough, very tough. She'd been built using a system of construction that was designed specifically to reinforce her against ice flows and other obstacles in her path during winter and other tough crossings. The dead straight front end and heavily reinforced framing that ran the entire length of the ship's hull. The Store Start was a rugged, formidable thing. Leading with over 10,000 tons of coal, the ship would take miles to stop. Good navigation and seamanship was crucial because ships like Store Start had been involved in dozens of collisions before. In 1895, a German ship had been sunk in minutes after being rammed by a freighter that was just like Store Start. The icebreaker bout turned out to be perfectly adapted, breaking other ships too. All of this kind of been far out of Captain Anderson's mind as his vessel plodded its way up the St. Lawrence River. But with an experienced crew and years of his own life spent before the mast, he was confident that reached Montreal the next day, Mrs. Anderson might even do some more shopping. He smoked his pipe and watched the river in front. As the sunset and early summer air developed a chill, passengers aboard the Empress of Ireland began to retire for dinner. They'd already spent a few hours exploring the ship, but no doubt, many were just exhausted after traveling, only to arrive at the Quebec docks. Many of them had come from all over Canada, the Great Lakes, and the American Midwest. Going through the rigmarole of boarding a liner, passing through inspection, customs, baggage was all extremely tiring. Many went to bed early. The tradition was that on the first night of a steamer's voyage, first-class passengers didn't even need to dress in their finery for dinner. Everybody was just too tired. There'd be time to explore the ship more tomorrow. Down in the first-class dining saloon, silverware and crockery gently clinked as hungry passengers happily ate their meals and shouted to their new shipboard companions. The Irvings were there. Henry sat in the car too. Ever the rake, he'd ignored tradition, dressed in his best. For dinner, the ship's string orchestra plucked and sought out the popular tunes of the day. The dining saloon was a gorgeous space with a huge glass Baroque dome that towered over it. As the passengers dispersed from dinner, many would have enjoyed the other spaces at their leisure. The gorgeous music room, a richly decorated salon centered on the top of the dining saloon's dome, a pier. Passengers could sink into sofas and listen to strains from the grand piano. Elsewhere, they converged in the library or the smoking room. The Empress wasn't as big or glamorous as the larger transatlantic liners of the day. She was pretty darn close in second class. Diners chatted away. Happily, they had a similar array of comfortable rooms to enjoy, like a smoking room and library. The Salvation Army members were excited. The mood on board was festive. Many had never left Canada before. After dinner, the band formed up again and gave an impromptu concert for third class. Lost. As dusk turned to night and the temperature dropped even more, only the hardiest passengers stayed up, playing cards or smoking. The ship was well on its way, now approaching Rimouski, where it would drop off the pilot. Up on the bridge, Captain Kendall stood in the darkness with his officers. And that pilot, Adelaide Lauriche, his job was to help guide the Empress out of the treacherous St. Lawrence. As far, the point just past Rimouski. He was a local, and he knew the waters like the back of his hand. The bridge was always kept in darkness to preserve night vision, but that night, there was a more dangerous menace to visibility: fog. As the competing air currents converge on the cold river water. In early summer, St. Lawrence is notorious for generating impenetrable banks of fog, seemingly at random. As the Empress of Ireland passed little towns that dotted the river banks, fog banks crept in, and the ship would have to be slowed right down. It was a tiring process, but it had to be done. Safety was paramount. Captain Kendall led a veritable floating town's worth of staff and crew with dozens of skills and specialties. Bakers and cooks, sailors and engineers, stewards and nurses, they all combined to create an army of people, some 400 strong, who kept their ship running as the young moon shone overhead. The ship's night stewards were on duty, manning the corridors in all three classes. Their job was varied, from ensuring passengers' shoes were shined to reporting on the half hour that all was well. But in the event of an emergency, they were also trained in lowering the ship's watertight doors without automatic lowering. It would be down to them to save the ship, but as the hours crept on and the deserted corridors, disaster must have been the last thing on their minds. At 1:00 a.m., the ship had reached farther point, and it was time for the pilot, Laurier, to hop off. He shook Kendall's hand, and as the Empress of Ireland came to a halt, the tiny pilot, Carter Eureka, came alongside. The ladder was laid over the side, and Laurier nimbly stepped off and onto the cutter. Then some sacks were tossed down, the last of the mail to leave the